Okay, namaste. I'm going to talk about creating individual daily lesson plans for distance learning. And at this point, you have an idea about short and long-term planning, and then how you want to break up your units, and then an estimate on the number of lesson plans per unit. So now we're going to get into how do you develop daily lesson plans to help students while they're at home. So the biggest difference we're dealing with is that students are basically going to be asked to do this learning on their own. Most of them won't have the help of their guardians, and they won't have the help of their teachers. So we have to create materials that are straightforward and as simple as possible and as clear as possible. And some suggestions to help in this is to make your lesson simple and focused. We don't need to be really complicated, and we don't want to be vague. We want to pick a target for each day as the objective and focus on that for the student. We want to provide additional notes on any material that might be harder to comprehend. So as you're looking through the textbook of what you've asked students to read, and anything is complicated or there's high vocabulary, that's when the teacher steps in and writes down additional notes to help clarify. We want to supplement with visuals whenever possible. So if it makes sense or there's a concept, again, that might be more complicated, let's put in a visual. And also think about what background knowledge the student needs to understand the concepts. Remember, they're coming in to the next year and they're carrying with them the material from the last year, but in some circumstances you might need to write down some review notes that will help them if that's what's needed. Okay, so for each lesson plan, we want to include the topic, which is the unit that those lesson plans fall into, the objective, so what's the purpose of the lesson, what do we want the students to learn by the end of the lesson, and a do now task. We'll be talking about that a little later. So besides that, there's possible learning activities that will help your students reach the objective you've decided. Some of those possibilities are assigned reading from the textbook, additional notes from the teacher for clarification, any supplementary materials to help students understand. Again, there's going to be more information on that part. Exercise assignments from the book. We want to include answer keys this time. Any hands-on or place-based activity or critical thinking reflection questions. So basically, as we get farther in the lesson, we want to start developing some deeper thinking, more critical thinking. And then when we find appropriate, the assessment with an answer key. Okay, so the daily objective, this is the purpose of the lesson. We want this to be specific. We want the students to have an understanding of what they're going to learn when they're done with the day, and use the same topic, so it's the same unit, but every day you're going to have a slightly different objective. And by including an objective, it helps the teacher stay focused when they're developing the lesson, and then it helps students know what they can expect to learn. Okay, so here's some examples of 3 days in a row that's all under the same unit, but the objective is the same, and it even gets slightly more complicated as we go. So for Monday, the topic's invertebrates, and the objective is that students will be able to define and know the major characteristics and identify common. So it's broad. They're getting an idea. They're getting hopefully excited about it, and then we get into more details as the week goes on. Now, when you're choosing the assigned readings out of the textbook, my suggestion would be to not assign the whole unit, but figure out which pages correlate with that day's objective. Keep it really focused and succinct. When I have my students read more complicated material from their textbook, I have them read it once through, and then I have them reread it and take notes. I feel it helps students break it down a little bit when they have to find notes for different paragraphs on the main idea. You may or may not want to do that, but it's just an idea. And then once students have either read through once or twice, if they're confused about anything they read, they should write it down now. Now, when you look at exercises from the textbook, choose only questions related to the daily objective. And oftentimes the textbook exercises, they won't You'll want to supplement them. So if you go back and look at your objective and there are not questions in the exercises that answer those, that help the students to answer or get to the objective, then add those that you feel appropriate. And hands-on activity, place-based activity, experiments, critical thinking. Again, this will be farther down the unit, but we do want the students to have some sort of, it creates a little more interest, maybe something hands-on, maybe something to help them get to know their sense of place or their family or their community better. And somehow that ties in what they're learning with those things. Okay, so I have an example here. This is the same sample I had before. I put some pictures on here so you get an idea. You don't have to worry about the science behind it or anything. I'll just show you what I did as a sample lesson. So again, learning about invertebrates, and we have a first page, just introduction, then it gets into the more details of the different phylums, and then we have the exercises. So here's my design for the lesson. Okay, so we have our unit. We have the first day, lesson 1, the topic invertebrate, and the objective of the first day is to define invertebrate. The students will be able to define invertebrate, know the major characteristics, and then identify some common invertebrates that can be found in Nepal. Or I even made it more specific and said Sirket, but it's still kind of a place-based question there. Okay, so for the do now, I sometimes like to give students something to do that will pull the topic to their own bodies or their own life. Now, this doesn't have to be that. Your do now can be a review from the day before, or something they're recalling, or something they think about. So because of what we're learning about, my instructions are reach your hand behind you and feel your backbone, and to then answer some questions about that. So what does it feel like? What does your backbone help you with? And what might happen to your body if you didn't have a backbone? Now, this is just to help the students understand that we're not talking about things unrelated to them. We're going to be learning about invertebrates, and they're vertebrates, and so to give them a little bit of sense of idea of what that means. So then if you don't have a backbone or a vertebrae, what might that mean? Okay, and that's it for that. I don't need to go into any more, they don't need to go into any more than that. Then I give the instruction to read page 1 and the paragraph on the top of page 2. So if we go back here, you'll see I just have them read this page and then the top here. Because if I go to my objective, I'm not getting into this yet. We're covering this. But after reading the textbook, I realized I didn't think the textbook covered enough information that I wanted to regarding my objective. So I added a couple supplementary materials. So on my lesson plan, I would add this graphic organizer. I think it's very clear, it's bright, it's big, you see little pictures, there are words in bold, some important words, and we can see animals are broken down into 2 categories, vertebrate, invertebrate. It's very clear. And I also listed some fun facts as a supplementary material. Now, sometimes I do this, it doesn't mean the students have to memorize any of these, but it's part of the building the excitement about the unit is to put in some interesting facts. So there's some interesting facts they can read. And then I created some exercise questions. After looking in the textbook, I also didn't think that their exercise questions were sufficient to answer my original objective questions or ideas. So I made my own. So the first one, what's an invertebrate? Number 2, what's the hard casing of some invertebrates called? And then I say, look at the picture of the invertebrate on the pages of this unit. So I want them to flip through the pages. What are 3 examples of invertebrates that you find in Sirket? So here we have these pictures, and they're looking through. We can see, once we get to the other page, we can say earthworms, leech, bee, housefly, spider, slug, snail. Those are what we might find in Sirket. So if they write any 3 of those, that's great. And then the last thing, just as a fun little game with pictures, I said circle the living things that you think are the invertebrates. So again, I said, do you think? So they're just kind of getting started with the idea. If they know invertebrates do not have backbones, which do they think don't have backbones? And then finally, I have the answer key to those questions. And that's it. So there's so many other ways to design a lesson, and there's so many other activities. But I wanted to go through one sample, how I would think as far as adding supplementary materials, even if they're not, very long or in depth, and some of the different activities that might get the students interested in what they're about to learn. So thanks, and best of luck.